We've all heard of red flags in a relationship. We know what red flags mean, but do we know what it means to actually collect red flags? This is very interesting. Many of us are in relationships right now where instead of just seeing the red flags, we're actually collecting them and walking through life with these, holding these, which is causing us stress, anxiety, resentment, and it also makes us question our reality. Are you in a relationship right now where you're collecting red flags? And how did it begin? And oftentimes, these relationships begin where somebody is doing some activities, some behavior, questionable choices, and certain things come to light. And you start collecting data points. Okay, that's interesting that happened. Or maybe you caught a conversation that you weren't supposed to hear. Maybe you were around and you overheard a situation where they were talking about a relationship you weren't supposed to know about. Perhaps you found some information that you stumbled upon that you weren't supposed to find that leads you to see that they were having an affair or lying about things, or they were somewhere that they said they were that they really weren't, doing something else. Okay. And I know that anytime that we find these types of pieces of information, it can be very overwhelming, sad, stressful. And it's the things that you don't want to find, right? But many of us are in these relationships and we love the other person. We care about the other person very deeply. And so we want to make that relationship work. And some of you see the red flags and you say, you know what, it's not a big deal. I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to overlook it. I'm going to find reasons. And it's not that you're thinking it instantaneously. Okay, I'm going to minimize this. You're not consciously thinking that. But your brain begins to minimize it. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. They were under a lot of stress. They were under a lot of pressure. Oh, their mom recently died. Their sister had a heart attack. That's horrible. They've dealt with this process. Or they were recently having to deal with whatever at work. And so we validate the things. We validate the things that they do. Now, I find it very interesting in these relationships too, because the person that seems to be collecting the red flags usually is the person that's pretty upfront and honest. I mean, maybe there's a couple of skeletons in your closet, but for the most part, you're pretty upfront and honest with that person, telling them how you really feel. And so it can be really disheartening when you realize that this person might not be actually telling you the truth. They might actually be far from telling you the truth, and they might actually be omitting the truth more often than not. And so how do we deal with this? How do we begin to confront the fact that this isn't just their issue with the fact that they are throwing us all these red flags, but to a degree it's our issue because we keep holding on to them. And I found that many of you might be holding on to them because maybe there was a time when you said, hey, this happened, how do you explain this? Can you explain this for me? What actually took place? And they deny it. Or maybe they turn it around on you. Well, you weren't there for me. You weren't there in my time of need, and so I went and found someone that was. Perhaps you end up becoming the reason for whatever the action is that they did that wasn't proper. And I know that this happens a lot because we end up taking, the blame for things. And so it's easy for someone to turn it around and blame us for something. And we might realize, immediately that this isn't really our blame. But a lot of times our brain, right, will try to change it around and turn it around to make it okay and try to find the reason why we should make up for it or accept this type of reality or accept this type of behavior. And I find that, it goes back to whether it's the lies or the multiple lies or the inconsistent stories or the omitting the truth or avoiding telling the truth. And all of these things are very interesting because we feel that maybe if I do better, if I express everything in my life and tell this person how I feel, maybe they'll begin to open up and change the way that they act. And I think that all of us hope for that. All of us hope that that person will wake up and just be honest and reasonable in the relationship and do the right thing. And that's the big question is, okay, will that actually happen? And then how long do we hold on to wait to see if this person can do that? And I think that many of us are giving excuses. And so if we're collecting these red flags, we're collecting them, but we just don't want to leave the relationship just yet. It's almost like we have to have more red flags. We have to collect more, and there has to be a worse and worse red flag, and eventually that's going to be the red flag that breaks the camel's back, and we get out of there, and we confront, and we move on, and we leave. And I don't know if that ever happens. Sometimes there are huge red flags. Sometimes there are huge indiscretions. Sometimes huge things come out, and it still keeps people in a relationship. And I understand, I'm not saying to throw away relationships, especially long-term relationships that you've gone through a lot over one or two things. That is not at all what I'm talking about in this content today. What I am talking about, though, is the consistent disregard. the consistent disrespect, and the consistent lies that you're dealing with. And I think also we internalize that and we start lying to ourselves about what we'll accept and what we won't. And we start lying to ourselves about their behavior and accepting their behavior and looking at their behavior and saying, okay, this is okay, I can deal with this. But in the process, what I found is that people who are collecting red flags and have been doing it for a while are probably very unhappy. And you might be happy for a moment. So it's not like I'm saying that everything's unhappy. That's why you're still collecting the red flags. Because there's times of immense joy. There's times where you have an amazing time in the relationship. But then there's times that it is the exact opposite, DEFCON 5, bad space to be in. And those are the times that I'm talking about, is that it's hard because you go into the depths of those and you feel that, but then when you have that high, you omit the red flags again. And sometimes you kind of forget all the previous red flags. And so you're collecting them. And then when you have this down where all of a sudden somebody is lying to you, they're avoiding you, maybe they're ghosting you for a period of time. All of these things are very important to really look at because they are playing with your emotions. They're not only playing with your emotions, but they're trying to get you to be there. They're trying to get you at their beck and call no matter what. Because if I constantly am changing the game plan and I'm constantly moving things, right? And I'm changing what the game is about as far as how you play the game. You're constantly on the defense. You're constantly running around trying to chase me while I can do whatever I want. I recently created several short videos on this to really look at all the pieces of the puzzle when it comes to collecting the red flags and understanding when you found yourself in that type of relationship. So if you found yourself in that type of relationship right now, I want you to be aware that you're probably feeling overwhelmed. You're probably feeling very tired. You have those amazing highs. You have those horrible lows. And that is beating you up. And it's also making you question everything around you because you're collecting all these things, but you don't want to see that reality. You want to change that. And also we want to internalize it and say, well, there must be something I'm doing that I can change to change their behavior. And again, that goes back to us thinking we can control the situation when in reality, that person has to control their own behavior. That person has to control their own outlet. That person has to control their own way of life. They have to control their own actions and their own behavior. And what we do can impress on them, but it's definitely not going to control them. And so if this is continuing in your relationship and you've been through the highs and lows of this for a long period of time, you have to ask your question, how long can you participate in this? And then how long is this going to really impact your health and happiness? And are you willing to continue to go through that in the hopes that this person changes, even though on a constant basis, you're still holding and collecting those red flags? Thank you for watching the video, and give us a like here if you found that the information in this video is useful. My question in the comment section, if you'd like to comment, is, have you been in a relationship like this? And if you have, did you finally break it off? And what was that big red flag? What was the thing that finally set it off? What was the thing that finally made you say, I don't want to deal with this anymore? Because I find that there's an accumulation of these red flags and an intensity of the actions and behaviors. And eventually one thing usually connects us so that we realize that I don't want to deal with this anymore. It's not right. This is not a healthy relationship. This is not bringing out the best in me. It's actually bringing out my fears. It's actually bringing out my stress and my anxiety. And it's also making me physically, mentally, and emotionally ill. Don't forget to live your true life.